Hello everybody here at the LibertyCon. We are back at this stage. And we will continue on no less important topic momentarily, but firstly a quick note. If you want to hear speeches of our own student volunteers, they are starting right now in the English room. So just this quick announcement and we will continue. Now, we are back in another panel, but unfortunately we reached the prominence again since the start of the year, and that's the tariffs and freedom of trade. In this session titled Trumponomics, in international trade, we will hear from macroeconomics expert and professor at the Prague University of Economics, Pavel Potužák. Another speaker, director of the Institute for Free Trade in London, Rob Armstrong. Our next speaker, offering a liberty-focused viewpoint as a host of the ReImagining Liberty Podcast, and he is Ross Powell. And moderating this timely discussion once again is Reem Ibrahim. She's communication manager at the Institute of Economic Affairs. So this is our next panel discussion. Enjoy this talk of our beautiful speakers. Enjoy.
Amazing. Thank you so much for that, and thank you to all of you for coming to watch and to listen. Of course, as we know, free trade is an incredibly important issue that is currently under threat more than it ever has been, I think, in the last decade or so. We are obviously facing huge protectionist policies from Donald Trump, but also the additional risk that other countries across the world are seeking to retaliate against that. Now, from my perspective, I think that, as we all know, no one individual can create absolutely everything that they can consume. No family or household can produce absolutely everything that they consume, the clothes that you wear or the food that you eat. And therefore, no country should seek to do so either, because, of course, as we know from thinkers like Adam Smith and David Ricardo, this idea that there is competitive advantage. And when you have that competitive advantage and you're able to devise labor, things are produced much more efficiently and you're able to alleviate poverty in so many ways. Now, of course, the practical concerns of that, I think we're going to be able to hear a little bit about that from all of our speakers, but also in your own respective countries, what you think that looks like specifically. So let's start over here with you. We'll talk a little bit about the American perspective, and you've got 5 minutes, although you don't have to use up all of it.
Okay, thank you. So I am not an economist. I am a philosopher and I suppose social critic, and I think that's okay because the current trade war, the current actions of Donald Trump really have nothing to do with economics and have nothing to do with policy. It is entirely about grievances and misunderstandings and a desire to reinstate an imagined past. So one way of putting this is that no matter how stupid you think what is happening right now is, it's actually significantly stupider. Trump, for one, doesn't understand how tariffs work. Like, he literally has no idea how they work, even though these have been his signature policy, his obsession for decades. They're the one thing that he has been consistent on is tariffs, and to this day, he doesn't understand what a tariff is, who pays it, how it works. And because of that, this is a pretty common thing. People, when they're in situations they don't understand, they often feel like they're being cheated. They feel like whatever is happening to them there's malicious intent, there's something untoward's happening because they don't understand it. Trump doesn't understand trade, so he feels like he and America, which he doesn't really distinguish, are being cheated. And then, as I said, really what this is about is this idea that there used to be a certain kind of past that we used to live in America. And the reason that we don't have that past anymore, the reason that our culture doesn't look like that, is because, in part, we have trade. And trade has ruined the economic foundations of that largely imaginary past. And so if we can just shut it down, we can bring that back. So I think when we talk about the current trade war, we have to think about it through that perspective. We can talk about the economic effects, which will be catastrophic. We can talk about the responses other countries will have, which will be completely understandable, but will make it all worse. But ultimately, it has to be through this frame that it's not really about economics. It's about culture, and it's about grievance, and it's about nostalgia for worlds that never existed. And so ultimately, what this is all about is Donald Trump is trying to break the world because he thinks in breaking it, he will bring into existence a world that really can't exist anymore.
Absolutely, that's really interesting. Thank you for that, Aaron. I think just to follow on from that, one of my colleagues, Dr. Steve Davies, who I know many of you will be aware of, talks a lot about political realignment, and I think that this kind of really encompasses that, the fact that on the right, very specifically, we've moved away from the ideas of free trade and liberty, and instead have moved towards basically a nationalism, and that's sort of what you described there, Aaron, this idea that we must protect domestic industry for some kind of notion of harping back to this romantic perspective on what the past looked like. And again, we'll, make no mistake about it, that past is one in which there is more protectionism, and of course many of those people that are living under those kind of economic circumstances are worse off. So I think what's interesting about that is it effectively an incorrect perspective on history, and I think the right is shifting towards that. And then perversely, on the left, there is that sort of more openness when it comes to those kind of economic issues. But of course, ideas of culture and nationalism seem to be taking precedent over it. Rob from the IFT, would you like to have your 5 minutes?
Yes, thank you. That was a much better segue than I think you realized, because what I really wanted to introduce was that yes, it's true that on the right, and particularly on the American right, there is this decline in the appeal of free trade. That isn't true on the left. Especially in America, we can see high-profile Democrats retweeting Milton Friedman and Ronald Reagan, and they're rediscovering what was the left-wing root of free trade. If we go back in British history, where I'm from, free trade was always a left-wing idea, right? It was associated with bringing prosperity to people from other countries. It was associated with a Christian mission. It was associated with many things that were not of the right. So to put a historical context on this, it's not necessarily the case that this realignment is unprecedented, and we may find ourselves having to find new friends. Those of us who are pro-free trade. I would also say that this American phenomenon hasn't exported itself around the world. We in Europe haven't really changed our attitudes on free trade that much in the last few months. I think the rhetoric has increased, but I think if you look at the UK, we've got two parties that are broadly pro-free trade, in theory, if not in practice. I think in Germany, we've got a broadly pro-free trade situation. I think there's plenty of optimism to add before we talk about the very depressing realities of this new global trading order.
There's also the perverse to that, right? That actually what Trump has done has actually resulted in a huge backlash, and a lot of polling has actually suggested that globally we might be seeing some of the largest increases in support for free trade that we ever have. So all of us are really bad at our jobs, but Trump doing awful things has actually resulted in attitudes changing quite dramatically. Pavel, would you like to have your 5 minutes?
Thank you very much for your invitation. Let me give you an economist perspective. Let me start with the quote of John Stuart Mill, who was not only an economist but also a political philosopher. So in 1984, in Principles of Political Economy, John Stuart Mill wrote, "And it may be said without exaggeration that the great extent and the rapid increase of international trade, in being the principal guarantee of the peace of the world, is the great permanent security for the uninterrupted progress of the ideas, the institutions, and the character of the human race." In other words, maybe Mill argued that the trade war is a preliminary for the open war. On the other hand, Trump and other mercantilists believe that international trade is a zero-sum game. So when a country exports goods, receives money, it gains, it has a profit, according to Trump. On the other hand, when the country imports goods and sends money abroad, it loses, it has a loss. According to introductory economics courses, this is a nonsense. Yeah? Consider barter. For instance, you have what I want and I have what you want. So when we exchange the goods, there will be a mutually beneficial exchange and the well-being of both of us will increase. We can engage in division of labor, we can specialize, which will increase productivity and output, total output in the world. Okay? So that's the first point I like to stress. We don't live in the barter economy, we live in monetary economy. So suppose that I buy some goods from you, I give you money, okay? And the question is, what are you gonna do with your money? You can purchase something from me later on. So there will be an opposite flow of exports and imports. You can keep your money in a pocket as a reserve. You can buy some of my assets, for instance, stocks of my company. And maybe the money I used for the purchase of your good was a loan from you. Okay? And this is exactly the actual position of the United States. It is the biggest borrower in the world. The United States is the biggest borrower in the world. So the key question is, why do the United States attract so much capital from abroad? Because actually the large trade deficits and deficits on the current account in the United States are financed by loans from abroad. So the major reason is that the real interest rate in the United States is relatively high, which attracts capital from abroad. So the next following question is, why is the real interest rate in the United States relatively high? There are three major reasons. The first is, American companies are still relatively profitable. That's why we all in Europe invest in S&P 500, by the way. Yeah? Secondly, there is a pretty low personal saving rate in the United States. Thirdly, there are large public deficits in the United States. So all these contribute to a relatively high interest rate in the United States. From the balance of payments perspective, there is a surplus on the financial account of the balance of payments. So the US is in the net borrowing position, and it must be immediately reflected in the deficit of the current account, or trade deficit if you want. So as long as there will be a surplus on the financial account in the United States, there must be a deficit on the current account, or trade deficit if you want. So how can we reduce the trade deficit in the US? An immediate idea of Trump was impose tariffs. Okay, might be a very good idea. When you impose tariffs on imported goods, this will reduce demand for goods from abroad, which can reduce the deficit. But unfortunately, in economics, it is a complex science. So the second step is, when people reduce demand for goods from abroad, they reduce demand for currency, for foreign currency. So the dollar will become stronger. When dollar becomes stronger, it will reduce exports from the United States and increase imports from abroad to the United States, which will increase the deficit again. So the only long-run outcome of tariffs is the same net exports, stronger dollar, and the reduction of the volume of the international trade. So tariffs reduce division of labor, specialization, and productivity and world output. So the problem was a strong dollar. So another idea might be, let's make dollar weaker. So let's interfere to the Federal Reserve System. The Trump can persuade the governor to devaluate dollar, okay? By buying foreign currencies flowing to the US and printing more money. Why not? But in the long run, this expansion of the money supply will increase the price level in the United States, which is by definition real appreciation of its currency. Higher prices in the United States will again reduce exports from the United States and increase imports. So it is completely futile, right? Whatever policy you engage. So there might be another idea. So the problem is the inflow of capital from abroad to the United States. Let's restrict capital flows. Let's eliminate capital flows. Of course, this will lead to the misallocation of capital across the world. But if we completely eliminate the financial account, yes, there is a trade deficit, the dollar will depreciate, and that can fix the problem. What we observed recently was, firstly, we can ask, okay, but the Americans should pay interest to the foreigners. But usually, we as foreigners reinvest the interest back in the United States. Firstly. Secondly, what we observe is the gradual reduction of demand for the American goods. Tourism is declining. China refused to buy Boeing, maybe for political reasons. So this increases trade deficit in the United States, which will lead to depreciation of the dollar. And maybe paradoxically, one thing may help to the American current account, and it is the sale of the American government bonds by maybe the Chinese government and by the Japanese. Okay? This will increase the supply of dollars, depreciate the dollar, and may fix the current account. So from the macroeconomic perspective, policy of Donald Trump is completely futile.
Thank you. No, that's really, really fascinating, of course, to hear it from an economist's perspective, but also the kind of rationale behind a lot of those decision-making, all of those decisions as well. I think that the real fundamental point here that I think is one of the largest misconceptions in trade policy is that the country only benefits when they are exporting lots and lots of goods and that there is that surplus in that way. And of course we know that that's not the case at all. I mean, the fact that American consumers are able to access a plethora of products across the world that are produced more cheaply means that they are able to access those goods and the cost of living is lower than it otherwise would be. And I think what's interesting is I'm somewhat less optimistic than Rob on that. I think that I'm usually the optimist, which is a difficult thing. But I think that generally speaking, we seem to be losing the argument on the right, and I think that is a political realignment problem more than anything. We've got about half an hour left, and I'd really like to open it up to the floor because I know that all of you will have some really interesting questions for our expert panelists. Let's start at the front over here. We've got a microphone, I think. Yes, we do. Wonderful.
Hello, my question is, what do you think how free trade works if a country are not so friendly politically? For example, if you develop specialization with a country and then that country wages a war or just cuts the supplies, like Russia cut supplies of gas, or China could cut supplies of semiconductors, this will affect the economically very harsh way. So how to counter it in proper way? What do you think?
There's actually a current debate in the UK. We were actually discussing this yesterday, Rob, specifically with steel in the UK, where a lot of conversations about, well, basically there is a consensus in the UK that we should nationalise the steel industry entirely. And a lot of it is because of this risk of importing things from China. Any thoughts?
Yeah, I'd just say that when it comes to security issues, the most stable supply that you can have is drawing it from as many sources around the world as possible. Does that mean that you will have a sudden, shortage of a particular strategic good if you end up having to go to war with Russia or whoever the supplier is? Possibly, but we've seen how quick some countries have been able to adjust themselves from one set of trade partners to a different set of trade partners. A recent example would be Qatar, that was completely embargoed, totally, not just tariff rate, but embargoed by all of its neighbors concurrently. And anecdotal comments from people who were there at the time was like, okay, it was difficult to get coriander for a week, and then we adjusted and life was okay. The same can apply to security goods as well as to consumer goods, but it really depends. I mean, there are loads of parts of the world that have really important geostrategic rare earth metals. Central Asia is a big one of them, and we currently don't really have a trading relationship with them. I say we, that's every country that's represented in this room from Europe and the United States. So there are many trade partners that we can open up to. There are many trade deals that can be done. And as a broad approach, if you sign trade deals and then the geostrategic reality requires that you no longer trade with these countries, then you're still in a better position than if you weren't trading with them in the first place. That's what I'd say.
Maybe even Milton Friedman many decades ago argued or opened the discussion whether we should protect, for instance, steel industry for the case of war. But Friedman also argued, okay, so once it is the steel industry, then it's agricultural products, thirdly, pharmaceutics, and so forth and so forth, and finally, you protect the entire market.
Yeah, that's interesting. It's also, I mean, from the UK perspective at the moment, where this is a really big discussion, it looks like it's going to happen, that steel is probably going to be nationalised. One of the biggest criticisms I often have with that kind of argument is actually, well, there's one particular plant in Scunthorpe in the UK that is probably going to be protected by the state. But if we went to war, Scunthorpe would be so inadequate in producing the amount of steel required. So we would still be reliant, and this is a positive thing, we would still be reliant on all of those other steel producing nations across the world. So really, I think there's an admission that it is this nationalism, it's the kind of harping back to that history, it's the feeling of protecting domestic jobs. That is really why they're doing it, not for security reasons. Other questions? No questions. Interesting. Okay. Oh, yeah, here.
So it seems that a lot of voters, for example, when you have a tariff discussion with them, it often, especially on the conservative right, it boils down to, hey, it's where the goods are coming from. And it boils down to not economics. Most people don't even care about economics, like the average voter. They're just like, what's a deficit, right? But they care about British food or Swedish industry. Should the conversation turn towards more promoting individualism when it comes to trade, or should we keep pushing on the economic side when most voters, they don't really know about economics?
It's a good question. And even when they talk in economics, it's often just a proxy for underlying nationalist attitudes or dislike of foreigners. This is actually why I think like Rob, I'm a little bit hopeful for what comes out of this, and I think it's because the one way you impress upon people the value of free trade and the value of trading with people who live in parts of the world that you've never been to is when you don't have it. You know, so the container ships are not running right now into the US. China, like, we're not getting goods coming in. This summer, there are very likely to be significant shortages of goods, empty shelves, and so on. And that is likely even if Trump were to reverse his policies right now, which he's not going to. He just keeps digging in more and more because, again, he doesn't understand how tariffs work. And I think that when you actually see it, when that's what will break through. So we can have these conversations. You can talk about the economics. You can talk about individualism. You can talk about cosmopolitanism. You can be like, you don't have a problem with the immigrant in your town selling you goods. You like them. We found that during the first Trump administration, when deportation started happening and people were like, oh, I actually like the Mexican family that runs the restaurant in my town. I didn't mean them. You know, it was the Mexicans who live in towns I haven't seen that are the real problem. You can have those conversations, but I think what really takes people seeing what the alternative looks like. And when the alternative is awful, if, you know, it could be Great Depression level, if Trump digs in enough and Congress doesn't push back, the response will be, oh, actually a lot of the stuff I really liked was the result of trade. Maybe we should bring it back.
Do you think Trump will reverse any of these tariffs, or do you think that he's going to stick to his guns?
I lean it's unlikely he's going to reverse them. I think that he literally thinks of tariff. How does a tariff work? The importer pays a tax to their government, right? It's a tax on your own people. Trump thinks, and he repeats this all the time, he thinks that when we put a tax on China, it means China is cutting checks to the United States, and that money is coming from the Chinese treasury so he thinks it's free money. It's not how it works. That makes it harder to think that he's going to back down because he's not going to understand why things, like when China stops shipping stuff to us, he's going to blame China instead of him. I also just think the other issue is he is very clearly in significant cognitive decline, like much worse than he was in his first administration. He's basically checked out. He doesn't seem to understand what's being asked of him in interviews. All of that also, like, things could get really hard and he's not going to recognize it. Maybe he does. Maybe very wealthy investors that he has around him are like, wait a second, you have to stop. But I'm not optimistic. I think it would have to get awfully bad for him to back down.
Does anybody else want to come in on that?
Maybe as far as the perspective of an ordinary person is concerned, I think we observe something that we can call failure of economics propaganda in the good sense. When you compare, for instance, the beliefs of people in flat Earth, virtually nobody believes in flat Earth. So astronomers were more successful in that case, but as regards free trade, economists were not as successful. So this is a kind of a failure, and I can see a big role for economics education. How is it possible that the president of the largest economy in the world believe in mercantilism, which is a dead theory of, 300 years? It's ridiculous, isn't it?
I think what's also interesting is the response from other countries. I mean, I was arguing for this on BBC 5 Live on a Friday night when we were talking about what the UK should be doing in response. And a lot of people were saying, well, should the UK retaliate with tariffs, or should we try and negotiate for a free trade agreement with the US, or should we try and negotiate a freer trade agreement with the EU? And I said, we don't need to negotiate with anybody. We just need to reduce all tariffs to zero and we will be wealthier. I mean, we don't need to negotiate with other countries, really. What we need is to implement a policy of unilateral free trade. And it doesn't matter what Trump does, it doesn't matter what China does, it doesn't matter what other countries do. If we ourselves reduce all tariffs to zero, we will be wealthier, and we could do that tomorrow, and it doesn't matter what other countries do. So I think what's interesting is just making the more radical argument in a way that will mean that our own countries will be wealthier, mean that domestically we're able to shift the narrative a bit more towards that. Because there is this kind of perspective that we have to kind of harp at other countries. Trump is showing off about this as well. He's saying, these other countries are begging him for free trade agreements. Like, you don't need to. You can just reduce your own tariffs to zero. Any other questions?
If I could just
Yes,
follow you on that point. I think you're absolutely right that Trump is he may not understand what he's doing, and I think that's pretty obvious when it comes to tariffs. But I think what he does understand is he is a performer, and the discussions between Trump and Starmer, the Prime Minister of the UK, had been going quite well, and the word was that they were sort of at the last minute trying to say, just don't put these tariffs on us because we're almost there on this deal. And Trump said, oh no, we can't do it. And the reason for that is he wanted to put these tariffs on the UK so that when the trade talks 2 weeks later became pretty much public information, that he could show the UK groveling and kowtowing to the new emperor in Washington, right? So I think there's a sense in which he still does understand this performance, and I think that he does want to see countries coming to him and asking for a better deal, and he'll sell that deal on his own terms. When it comes to a trade deal with the US, obviously with tariffs, you're absolutely right, but there are also non-tariff barriers between the UK and the US, and we desperately do want a deal to blast all of those out of the way. There's still a role for trade policy.
Do you want to explain a little bit about that? I know we've discussed it in the past, specifically to do with American and British trade agreements, where a lot of those non-tariff trade barriers, specifically with things like workplace licenses and sort of having that mutual recognition. Mm-hmm. Do you want to explain a bit about that?
There is some scope for mutual recognition in professional qualifications and educational qualifications. A lot of times, you'll know more, but the US states have individual federal sort of devolved, we would say, competences to regulate architects or lawyers specifically in each individual state. So there's not necessarily a broad, simple stroke that we can write. But what we can do is we can just say we accept all US qualifications in the UK as if they were qualified in the UK. And that would create a positive pressure on American trade associations and and etc. To do the exact same. Because why do all these Americans get to go over and practice in Britain? We want to be able to do that.
We want those Brits too.
Yeah,
but again, that's not something we negotiate. That's something we could just do now.
It's not really part of the government's responsibility. I mean, it can be in some cases where the government has actually prevented these things from happening. It is the government's problem, and they need to fix it. But a lot of times, it's just associations and industries self-regulating, which is good, and we don't want to blow that up or supersede it. So, and we've done this. The UK has signed trade deals with Florida, I think with 6 or 7 other US states. Someone may be able to correct me on the exact number, but and the basis of those trade deals was just about professional qualifications, and so there's a role for that. There's a role for a more state-level lowering of non-tariff barriers. That's about data and AI, and it's where this big choice for the UK, which is fascinating, I'm sure, for Europeans as well, is how is the UK going to position itself in regulatory terms between the US and the EU. And I think, in my opinion, if you're talking about any innovative industry, the US innovates and the EU regulates. So we should be as close to the US as possible. But there's no reason to choose either. Like, again, this sort of decentralized approach of we accept both regulatory frameworks in the UK is just superior to any other statement that you can make if you want to have maximum compatibility and maximum freedom to innovate in your own country.
Indeed, that's interesting. Pavel, from your perspective as an economist, what do you think I'm not asking you to use a crystal ball and predict what will happen, but what do you think the impact will be on American consumers over the next few years? And do you think it will be enough political pressure for things to sort of change within the US, but also globally? I mean, do you think that there will be that kind of pushback?
It's a very tough question. So Trump is changing opinion every day. So it increases uncertainty, and this increase in uncertainty can lead to kind of recession, right? So when he always observes an increase in returns on government bonds, he steps back. So maybe when he observes that his activity leads to increase in uncertainty, he reduces making uncertainty, if you understand me.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. I think it's interesting from that perspective if we see that impact globally. Any other questions from the audience? Yes, you've got one at the back.
You just said that Trump often changes his decision or his opinion. I just wondered whether I could quickly share a meeting I had. When I was working in Brussels, one of his ambassadors said to me, what you've got to understand about Trump is that if he doesn't like a current agreement, what he'll do is he'll make you pick up the phone. So when he wanted to renegotiate NAFTA, rather than asking the leaders of those countries, he imposed tariffs, so they had to call him, and they renegotiated. Now, an interesting thing that was told to me by the European EU negotiator was that when Trump had that conversation with the EU, he actually said to the person he had a conversation with, let's now do 0% tariffs, 0% non-tariff barriers, and no subsidies. And the EU person said, I can't deliver that, can you? So I just wonder, given that anecdote, what's your reflection, or do you think that he's just completely inconsistent and it's not really a clever ploy to pull down tariffs, but actually it's the way, I think what Aaron said, it's, he believes tariffs are themselves a good thing in themselves.
I don't think anyone has ever lost money underestimating Trump. So I think the indicators are he simply is inconsistent. I think we spent much of his first term trying to, he's playing four-dimensional chess, gaming out, like, what's the strategy behind it. There's been attempts to do that we're only 100 days into this, into the first 100 days of this administration, and he consistently seems to disrupt those kinds of predictions. And he's backed down on the tariffs somewhat, but then put them back, and then changed the levels, but then not changed the levels. And I think at this point, it makes a lot more sense to just view him as inconsistent than to continue to try to predict that there is some underlying strategy, because that just gets disrupted over and over and over again.
From the perspective of game theory, sometimes it might be optimal to be unpredictable. but I don't know what game Trump is actually playing from the game theory perspective.
Just making his own country poorer. One of the biggest annoyances, I think, from the entire situation is that Trump called the implementation of all these tariffs Liberation Day. Like, what is liberating about implementing whole new swathes of taxes on your own people? Nothing. Absolutely zilch. Do any of you have anything to add to that at all?
Yeah, I don't think anyone knows what the strategy is. I think there's something to the point I made earlier that he's a performer and he sees it as winning. And so, as Said was just saying, it's not clear that he's being consistent. Maybe he is being consistent on the view of he wants to appear to win every time. And it's this sort of egomaniacal approach that he has. I think the other point to give voice to is he does care a lot about enriching himself and his cronies. This sort of mass market chaos is an environment where insider information is worth a lot. And I think that's a point sort of worth making, that there is this sort of massive moral hazard if you have no moral sort of qualms whatsoever, that from a position of the presidency you can make your friends a lot of money.
Interesting. We focus a lot on Trump and what he's done for obvious reasons, but I wondered if I could get some of your thoughts on what's happening in the rest of the world. I mean, from my perspective at least, I'm quite impressed by Africa as a continent. I mean, almost all countries now have signed the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. We've got effectively so many more barriers that are being pushed down, more than ever in Africa. And of course, I think that it makes it a lot more of an attractive place to invest. Obviously, there are other barriers, and Rob, you spoke about non-tariff trade barriers. In the African continent, a lot of it is, as a woman, as an entrepreneur, if you're trying to trade and bring goods between different countries, the barrier for you is the risk of sexual assault at the border, or the risk of being required to give a bribery at the border. So the non-tariff trade barriers are very different in countries like that. But I wondered if you guys could maybe share some thoughts on that. Do you think that there are areas of the world where there is a lot of that kind of positivity?
Well, in terms of the African Continental Free Trade Area, the AFCFTA, as it's unappealingly called.
Lovely word.
No trade has actually happened. It's a brilliant agreement, but not a single good has traded under the terms of the AFCFTA, which tells you...
Why is that?
Legal problems, and the fact that Africa is just fundamentally broken in the sense that it's split up into like 6 different regional trade areas that in many ways work and overlap, and there's countries that are members of 3 or 4 of them, but not the other ones, and it's just such a complicated web of agreements that already exists that are not properly enforced. And as you say, you get to the border, and he wants his share. So what do? You're going to prefer to use the systems that are already in place. AFCFTA has potential. It's a really cool agreement, and it's really well written. But it's not working just as of yet. In terms of optimistic bits around the world, I mean, India is the most pessimistic place to go for free trade generally, but it has actually been signing agreements, and there's 1.4 billion people in India, and if they continue on this trend and they start signing, they've started with some Gulf states, if they keep signing trade agreements, it will solve their massive internal problem, which is that they're a state. They're a federal state, right? They're made up of different countries, each of which has a devolved trade competence, right? They're allowed to make their own trade rules to some extent, which just means that internal trade within India is broken, and external trade with India is very difficult to negotiate and make worthwhile. So if these trade deals can sort of pry open India, that's where I think the big potential upside is.
I think it's quite paradoxical that China, a totalitarian country, is proposing free trade.
Aaron, do you have any thoughts on this? No? Okay, amazing. Any other questions at all whilst we get to the end? Yes.
Thank you very much. I would like to ask about, there was some chatter about specific US, specific like software companies getting exemptions from the tariffs for either favors or straight out cash from Trump. And I would like to ask, because this is straight out of the mercantilist playbook, right? The king would give out specific privileges to specific companies in exchange for cash. And I would like to ask, what does this mean for the IT industry, but rather industry that is getting these privileges in the long run?
So yes, this is clearly what Trump has in mind. There was an interview he gave recently where he said he wanted to make some number of deals, and the number of deals was larger than the number of countries that exist. And in other parts of it, it became relatively clear that he meant making deals with companies too on the tariffs for specific exemptions. And I think it just, a lot of it speaks to Rob's point, like he likes to feel like a winner, and he is quintessentially a bully. Like that's just his whole personality. If you kind of think of the stereotypical bully, you can predict a lot of Trump's behavior. Like he'll back down fairly quickly in the face of like someone actually standing up to him, as we saw, say, with Harvard fighting back against some of the defunding. But he wants to win, and what he really likes is when these very wealthy people come and grovel in front of him, and then he can throw them some scraps. And so I think we're going to see some of that. The effect is going to be, the big incumbents are going to benefit because Tim Cook can negotiate a deal, but your small Silicon Valley startup probably can't. They can't get face time with Donald Trump, and they're not rich and famous enough for him to feel that good about them groveling in front of him. He doesn't care. So I think that's going to be one effect, is the big guys will cut deals and the smaller firms and the startups will continue to face pretty significant economic costs.
It's fundamentally uncompetitive, isn't it?
Actually, Trump opened a larger space for rent seeking.
I mean, that's the really interesting point, actually, the interplay between government and politics, and actually the way in which this is sort of basically a really good example of Gordon Tullock and sort of thinking about the kind of public choice theory and the way in which the interplay between rent seeking and government decisions. Do you guys have anything to add? And if not, I think we've got a couple of minutes. Any other questions? All good, amazing. Well, thank you guys so much for coming. And I think it was a really, really interesting discussion. Thank you to my speakers. Thank you.
Thank you once again here, main stage. And we can continue to another presentation or performance or something like this. Yes. So, dear lovers of freedom, anyone in the audience still not convinced that tariffs are poor economic policy? Our next speaker excels at convincing you in under 2 minutes through his famous music videos. Perfect. Okay. We have a time for this stage, just to make a beautiful place and space for our next speaker.